Cyphers. We used to be called sorcerers, a rare breed of being that could wield mind-controlling powers. In reality, we could control electrical impulses, but we didn't come into our own until the first real computers were invented. Then we became tech gods. While we are still at an advantage to most, even those days are past now. Now, we're a curiosity in a world where tech bridges all the gaps and has mostly replaced magic. My name's Ulf Whitlock. I'm one of a small number of people who has inherited the powers of the Cyphers. I'm also a hunter. I track down criminals for the government and that juicy paycheck. I even have my own badge. I take on all types: orcs, elves, goblins. Shoot first, ask questions maybe. That's how Dad did it, it's how his dad did it, and I'm one for tradition. Welcome to the world of cybernetics and the punk. To my world of magic, blood, sweat and steel. Welcome to the Cyphers Edge. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling. Sleep wasn't coming tonight, and that patch of water damage in the right-hand corner of my room was really starting to bug me. I stared at it, willing it to shrink, but to no avail. I slid out of bed, doing my best to stay quiet. I wasn't sure if Fia was awake, but I didn't want to disturb her if she'd managed to get her head down. I didn't have a clue how she survived on what I surmised to be only a few hours of broken sleep a night. Maybe it was a werewolf thing. I stepped out into the living room and decided to get some fresh air. Since I wasn't getting any sleep anyway, I cracked an iced coffee I'd stashed in the fridge the day before, and opened the door to the balcony as softly as possible. The night air was cool and a light breeze was blowing in from the west. The buildings used to be offices at some point, then they became units, people retrofitting balconies and hanging gardens. Ours was a corner apartment, the balcony wrapping around to the side where Fia's room was, though there wasn't a door there. Plant life hung down from the floors above and helped to soften the look of the old multi-story hulk of a building. 50 years back, the cataclysm had rocked the city and leveled large chunks of it. A terror attack that had killed tens of thousands and was felt on a global scale. There were odd pockets of the original city, like the court. Some areas were new, catering to the rich and the high life. Some areas had never been rebuilt, and the residents lived in squalor. In many ways, Perth had become more dangerous, and at the same time, from a balcony several stories up, she was pretty damn beautiful. I looked out southwest, taking a sip of my iced coffee. There was more buildings in that direction, and a hint of the river beyond. Windows lit and dark scattered the night, and I looked from one to another, watching the inhabitants go about their lives while I mulled things over. The case Les had brought to me this afternoon. I checked the time. Yesterday afternoon. It was bothering me. Not the killing. It was a new technique, whatever the mark had done. But the way he had disappeared. I'd pulled the vid file apart. It wasn't edited. It hadn't been modified in any way I could tell. It was almost like he had been a hologram and just decided to be switched off. Something seemed familiar about it. It had a feel of magic mixed with tech, akin to my own powers. I took another long sip of coffee and turned the problem over in my head. If there was a new player in town, someone was bound to have heard something. Word gets around in the underground of this city like gossip in a witch's coven. Shaky would know, or he would know someone who knew. I'd have to go hit him up tomorrow. Later today. He'd be too busy this time of night. I took another sip of coffee. Yeah, Shaky. I bet he'd missed me. Fia and I spent the morning, and a good chunk in the middle of the day, researching any similar killings anywhere else in the country, then internationally. It was tough, lots of unexplained deaths, but most you could read between the lines as to what might have been the cause. Very few were conspicuous by their lack of evidence. Either the police hadn't given enough of a shit to upload the data, or it didn't exist. It was hard to tell the difference. This is boring as shit, I complained as I tried to read another police report and actually take in the information. This is my life, Fia sneered. What do you think I do when we're on a job? I shrugged. Watch cartoons and eat pizza. She scoffed. I don't eat pizza in work hours. I got to my feet and stretched my back. I could hear a series of cracks, and I was pretty sure it wasn't my subdermal armor shifting. I need to get out of here, I said. I'm gonna go see Shaky. Fear flicked fingers that only just protruded from the end of her hoodie sleeve, shooing me towards the door. Yeah, pussy. Leave the real work to someone who can handle it. She wasn't actually looking at me, so she missed the middle finger I flipped up at her as I stepped out the door. As the door shut, I just caught the words chasing me out. And bring back pizza. I rolled my eyes. Typical. The girl could clean out an all-you-could-eat buffet. I took the stairs, like out of choice, then paused to put on my coat in the foyer. The door opened and Mrs. Chen came in. Every apartment building in the world has a woman like Mrs. Chen, middle-aged to old, single, Asian descent, and cooks insanely good food. Good morning, Ulf. I nodded to her. Mrs. Chen, how's it going out there? She put her bags of groceries down on the floor and shook her hands out. Not good. A shooting down the end of the terrace. Cops everywhere. I frowned. Really? I didn't hear any sirens. Me neither, but word is 3 dead and no sign of the shooter. Probably some tweaker flipping out, I said, opening the door to the sounds of the street beyond. If they're putting holes in other tweakers, I could care less, she said as she picked up her bags. She gave me a friendly nod and started up the stairs. I stepped outside. The court was packed. I pushed past all sorts and made my way out into Hay Street. It wasn't a long walk to the club district, formerly known as Northbridge, now simply called The Bridge. Shaky had possession of a club in prime position opposite a park there. I say possession because he didn't actually own it. He just sort of ended up with it somehow, and now the little bastard sold drinks, drugs, and information for the right price. For me, though, it was usually free. I knew who legally owned the club, and I had the docs to prove it. The front doors to the Brass Knuckles were closed, but unlocked. I eased them open and poked my head inside. Instinctively, I brought the sight of energy signatures and data streams to my eyes. The club was still, no one present in the main room. The front doors opened to a high vaulted space, a U-shaped bar in the center of the room. Raised dance floors and cages suspended from the ceiling. A few doors led off the main space to private rooms. The one at the back of the bar led to the storerooms and offices. I jumped the bar, grabbing a beer from one of the fridges and popped it open on the door handle as I walked out back, making my way through the storage room into the short hall that linked a couple of the office spaces. Shaky's door was open a crack, and the sound of classical music drifted out. I knocked politely and waited for the cracked sound of Shaky's voice to usher me in. Who is it? Your favorite hunter. That's an oxymoron if ever I heard one. I smiled and pushed the door open. The music dimmed down as I made my way across the floor to a large Jarrah desk. Seated behind it in an old-fashioned wing-back leather chair was a goblin. A goblin with wisps of black hair oiled and combed back, beady red eyes, and wearing a rather slick black suit, completed with a red tie to match his eyes. He looked about as intimidating as you could get for a goblin. His body was heavily modified, and the only reason it didn't show was the suit. Nothing but a few cranial implants were obvious. Shaky was successful for a goblin, and that was an oxymoron. He had scammed and stabbed his way into a position of power in the underworld over the last 15 years. He was cunning, and everyone expected him to keep carving his way to the top of the pile. He hadn't, though. He'd gone and made himself halfway legitimate, and settled into a nook. What's shakin', Shaky? I settled myself into one of the 2 seats opposite him and took a pull on my pilfered beer. That's the first time I've heard that joke today, he said, rolling his eyes. How's business? I asked in a more respectful tone. No need to push my luck. I was here for help after all. He shrugged. One of our most popular supplies is late on delivery. I'm low on the ranch sauce the orc crowd seems to love so much. The joys of legitimate business, I said sympathetically. He raised an eyebrow. You try telling a bull orc that he can't have his favorite hot wings after a few too many pints. I took another mouthful of beer and cringed. Yeah, actually, I don't envy your staff. So, to what do I owe the pleasure, Hunter Whitlock? Straight down to it. Shaky must have actually been busy. I dug into my pocket for a copy of the NFC card that Les had given me and passed it across the desk. Shaky picked it up like a throwing card between the tips of his index and middle finger and held it to his left temple. His eyes showed the telltale dullness that everyone gets when their vision is being overlaid with internal imaging. That's new, he said, lowering the card but staying unfocused, probably re-watching the video. I waited to give him time to inspect the footage. Ever seen anything like that before? He shook his head and tossed the card onto the desk. No, and I'm guessing Fear had picked it apart and found no corruption? It wasn't a question. I can do my own data sifting, you know, I said indignantly. He scoffed and relaxed back into his chair. And I can serve drinks, but elf chicks do it better. That sister of yours hunts for data like she'd hunt for blood. I tensed up at that. I knew he was just trying to get his own back for the joke I'd made, but he knew Fear was a touchy subject. She doesn't, I said flatly. He grinned a pointy-toothed grin. Not what I heard. Word gets around, Ulf. Your sister and a certain night out on the town. I gritted my teeth, trying to keep my cool. Yeah, well, no one's perfect. He mimed throwing something over his shoulder, like the topic was inconsequential. Look, I'm not gonna judge. Doug's got a hunt, boyo. But you take him off the scent of blood, they swap the obsession for something else. And if there's a better sifter than your sister in this city, they're on someone big's payroll. I forced myself to relax. He was done poking fun. Now he was just telling a few home truths. We both picked over it. It's clean. You've got me. I've never seen anything like it. Ever heard of anyone killing like that? He shook his head. Looked like a vamp draining a blood bank, but you know, without the blood. I nodded. My thoughts exactly. If I was hazarding a guess, I'd say they were draining their life. But that's some mystic shit outside my ken. I sighed and took another long drink. Any suggestions? He shrugged. I can put the word out, but whoever they are, they'll probably hear about it. I knew that was a risk, but I had to find this stranger one way or another. Do it. It might light a fire under them, get some action one way or another. Shaky nodded and leant back into his paperwork, pointing at the door with his pen. You'll forgive me if I don't see you out. I stood, turned to leave, and tossed the empty bottle into the bin in the corner of the room. And that's going on your tab. Yeah. I closed the door behind me and the classical music resumed in the office. Well, that was kind of a bust. Not that I didn't trust Shaky to put the word about, but it didn't get me anywhere right now. Well, I was out and about and might as well make the most of it and do a little legwork. I spent the rest of the day asking about. I didn't have high hopes though. If Shaky hadn't heard anything, the chances some other punks had were pretty slim. I hit up Fear to see if she had uncovered anything, but the clues were fresh out. My options were thin on the ground, and it was fast approaching dusk. The sun was going down, and the scum was coming out. I was walking around the bridge alone and starting to get some attention. This part of the city still held large chunks of nightlife and entertainment, but it wasn't just for anyone. The locals could tell an outsider, and the outsiders came here to live on the edge. If you didn't travel in groups, you were asking for trouble. I had a couple of new friends following me. It was like watching dingoes following something that they weren't sure if it was prey or not. I hadn't had a good scrap since the train. I sped up, pretending to panic, but trying to hide it. I looked from right to left and walked down an alley, then took off my coat and pressed myself up against one wall. The two wannabe muggers came round the corner, smirks fixed on their faces. One had the most punk rock blue mohawk I'd ever seen, with chrome teeth, and the other one had a shaved head covered in tattoos. Both rocking classic leather jackets that everyone thought made them look tough. I didn't even wait for them to make the first move. I threw my coat over Mohawk and punched him square in the throat. I could hear him wheezing and gasping for breath as I engaged his buddy. They were both human, both about as modded up as you could get with the kind of cheap back alley cutter they could afford. My new friend spat once and lunged at me. I saw a metal plate extend from the top of his hand and drop down to cover his knuckles. I knew exactly what that was. Electrified knuckle dusters. Fun. I dodged the first couple of punches and moved in close, turning side on. Reaching up, I gripped his wrist as he tried to pull his punch back. Then I twisted my arm around his forearm and brought my other hand up, slamming into his elbow. I could hear the joint crack. He cried out in pain. A hand gripped my shoulder and turned me around. Mohawk was breathing again. I took 2 solid punches to the stomach before getting in any of my own. I was desperately trying not to use my powers. No point giving the game away to these two punks if I could help it. But I got tired of the down and dirty pretty quickly and deployed my punch dagger. It slid free and the two punks backed up. Mohawk popped a punch dagger of his own and looked ready to get down to business. The other reached inside his jacket and pulled out a small caliber revolver. I raised an eyebrow. Small caliber like that wouldn't even make a dent in my subdermal armor. I took a step forward. He unloaded the revolver. I looked down at the holes in my shirt. The bullets scattered around me, then back up at the faces of the punks. Only now did they show any worry. Mohawk didn't even wait to hear his mate's exclamation of panic. He charged me. It was sloppy, and I was quick with a deflection and riposte as I severed his hand from his wrist. I hadn't wanted to actually start carving them up, but he clearly wasn't going to back down. Baldy, on the other hand, ran for it, gun abandoned in the dirt of the alley. I grabbed Mohawk by the collar and slammed him up against a graffiti-covered wall. He winced in pain as I gripped the stump of his wrist and ground it against the concrete wall. Not your smartest career move, I spat in his face, making sure not to get too close. Fuck you! Sorry, what was that? I twisted his stump against the wall again and he cried out. Ah! Good. Now, what was your plan here? I'm not the richest looking tourist. We were told to find you. I pressed harder into the rough surface. Ah! He cried out in pain. We were paid to mess you up. That was unexpected. I didn't skip a beat. By who? Don't know who, he gasped out. Some dude in a hood with a helmet on. What kind of a helmet? He shrugged as best he could. One of those ballistic ones. No markings or nothing. I let my dagger slide forward and press into his throat, just enough to make him feel it. Where and when? I asked patiently. Or you'll be getting a serious haircut. His eyes flicked up to his forehead and then down to the knife, stupidly weighing his options. Not that kind of a haircut. I left him bleeding in the alley, with a very clear instruction that if I ever saw him again, he'd lose more than just a hand. He'd given up a few extra details. The guy who'd paid them didn't have any sensors on the helmet he'd been wearing. It was stripped back to raw metal. I knew the kind of helmet from the description. It was a tech ops style thing, but to not have any sensors on it, how were they seeing or hearing? When not switched on, they were like wearing a sensory deprivation pod on your head. Probably some melodramatic wanker wanting to make a name for himself. I tried to think back to anyone who would want to pay some punks to mess me up. It was a long list. I decided to call Les. The icon of his face overlaid my vision as I continued to stride through the bridge. He answered on the third ring. G'day, mate. His voice was low, probably in the office. Hey, you at work? He grunted a reply. Yeah, paperwork coming out the arse. Can you talk? A pause. Probably. I just got jumped by two thugs in the bridge. Well, you know what we call killings on the street and the bridge. I paused. What? I asked hesitantly. Suicides. Anyone dumb enough to go unprepared through there is asking for it. I wanted to chuckle, but it was kind of sad too. Yeah, well, this wasn't random. They'd been paid to fuck me up. Liz's tone changed. Interested, not worried. Really? Who the hell would want to pay a couple of punks to work you over? There's a list as long as my arm, I said casually. No, there isn't. What? I was confused. You know there's a ton of assholes in this town wanting to see me in traction. But none of them are going to try and hire two random thugs off the street. The big boys hire professionals, and every one of the bottom feeders would grab some friends and do it themselves. He was right. Anyone who had a real grudge against me would do it personally or professionally. That back there, that was sloppy. Is that why you called? No. No, I wanted to know if you'd heard anything about anyone going around with a modified tech ops helmet. I gave him the description the punk had given me. I could hear Les typing and waited. Nothing official, but I can ask around the depot. Sounds like someone's trying to get your attention. He paused, his mind jumping to the same conclusion mine had. I knew what he was about to ask. I've been asking around about our faceless friend all day. Yeah, I was just about to ask about that. The punk. He gave me a location of where they'd been hired. Les breathed in sharply. I wouldn't, buddy. Smells like a trap to me. He was right. You want answers, don't you? There was silence as he considered. I'll arrange some backup. How? You said this was off the books. Your CO won't approve it. He swore under his breath. At least wait until I'm off shift. I'll be your backup. I thought about it. I didn't want Les getting hurt, obviously, or worse, getting in trouble with his CO. But I could use a second pair of eyes. Fine, I'll meet you outside the depot. What time do you knock off? I leant up against the side of a cruiser in the Perth Central Police Depot car park. It was approaching midnight, Les's shift ending at 11 o'clock. Les exited the building. He was wearing his uniform with the sleeves rolled up and collar undone, a duffel bag gripped in one hand. What's in the bag? I asked as he grew closer. Some supplies. No one will miss them for a few hours. I shrugged, not wanting to draw attention out the front of a building with more eyes and ears than I cared to think about. I climbed into his car, one of the government-issued 4x4s that a lot of the cops chose to take as one of their own. It was kitted out with as much tech as the cop cruisers had, that Les could legally get his hands on. I looked around the cab, opening my eyes to my other sight. Electrical pulses and data flooded my vision, not just from inside the car, but all around us. The city was a nightmare to Cyphers who couldn't filter their vision. I managed to only focus in on what was immediately around me. The car was rigged to the roof with all sorts of tech, not to mention heavy ballistic armor in the body. You really went to town on this thing. Les nodded, and the glowing shape of his body in my sight shot with signals as nerves fired off and his brain interacted with his cybernetics. Les was almost as kitted out as I was. Some of my tech was a little bit less legal than his, though. Fia joked that I had X-ray vision, as my ability let me see through layers upon layers of physical objects to whatever was beyond, if it was sensible to my sight. I turned and looked in the back seat at the duffel bag. The ghostly shape of a heavy arms flak jacket was made visible by the weak electronic signals coming from an Almar Tech carbine, police-issued tactical helmet, and some heavy explosives. Really? Les looked at me as he turned over the ignition. What? Then he followed my gaze. I have a plan. Really? Ever heard of subtlety? Ever heard of being better safe than sorry? I reverted to my normal vision and we pulled out of the parking lot, heading back towards the bridge. Our destination wasn't far, but this was faster than walking, and Les wanted to keep the car close in case of emergency. We pulled up in front of an old derelict club that looked like it hadn't been run since the terror attacks. The street wasn't busy, but it wasn't empty either. Rubbish littered the streets. Orcs, elves, humans, they all strode past, attention elsewhere. You could tell the reputation of a neighbourhood by looking at the fashion of its residents. Mohawks, dreadlocks, and more piercings than rivets in a ship's hull. Body augmentations that were more for show than practicality. Chrome-covered limbs, backlit eyes, skin pigmentations, and a myriad of weaponry under it all. Not to mention the permanent optic and mouth upgrades for more efficient sight and the ability to eat and breathe almost anything. This was the kind of place that you could trust, because you knew you couldn't trust anyone in it. The old hulk of a building loomed over us. There was no windows, the front door stood ajar, no light showed from inside. So what's your plan? Les asked, reaching into the back seat and extracting his flak jacket. You go round back. Come in quiet, I'll go in the front just like they're expecting. You want me to put them down? He asked, holding up a clip of ammo. I shook my head. Only if shit goes really sideways. I want to have a chat first. Besides, if we don't take them in alive, we can't prove anything and I don't get paid. God forbid you don't get paid. I rolled my eyes. Want to hear my plan? He hefted the bag of explosives in one hand and grinned. Les loaded his weapon and pulled on the tactical helmet. It covered his whole face. No eye holes, just a sensory array that linked up to his cranial cybernetics and gave him more vision than he knew what to do with. Heat, ultraviolet, echolocation, the list went on. The helmet clicked and hissed as it sealed his whole head in a bulletproof sphere. My communicator made the connection, and we were linked with audio and visual from his helmet. I only bothered letting the standard visuals through though. He couldn't get visuals from my end, but something was better than nothing, and he could get audio. Ready? I asked. He nodded. We split up. He went down an alley at the side of the club, and I waited a good 10 minutes to let him get into the building from the rear and do his thing before I entered the front door. I pushed the front door wide open and strode in. The building was missing doors. There was holes in the walls and ceiling. I guessed that it had been dated from before the terror attacks, and had taken a large chunk of its damage during that event. I made my way down the entrance hall and towards what I guessed was the main space. The rooms either side of the hall looked like they'd been private booths at one point. Les was keeping radio silence, but I could see him sweeping each room he came across and finding nothing. We both weaved our way through the building, coming in a kind of switchback from both ends. I entered a large room. It was scattered with busted old tables and chairs. A stage stood in the centre, tatty old curtains flanking it, and a chandelier still amazingly hanging from the ceiling. I opened my eyes to my other sight and found no one hiding in the shadows. There was hardly anything in this room that even had a power source. Weak signals from old cables still active, and loose wires terminated ages ago. The only illumination was from a couple of holes in the ceiling high above. I felt a tingle, like a tickle in the back of my brain. Something wasn't right. I looked around the room again, reverting to my normal vision this time. A figure stepped out from the wings of the stage. A long black trench coat over a black hoodie, the hood pulled up. As they walked to the centre of the stage, I saw the helmet underneath. Just like the punk had described, it was like the one Les was wearing, but with all of the sensory array stripped away. How they could see or hear anything with that thing on was impossible. I looked at my visual link with Les. He was just entering the balcony to my right. I could see myself and the figure on the stage in his vision. "I believe you sent me a message." There was a pause. The stranger inclined their head. "Yes, and you were extremely predictable." The voice was calm, patient. It wasn't even muffled by the helmet. In fact, it was insanely clear. It was like it was bypassing my ears to arrive straight in my head. "I have some questions for you, if you wouldn't mind answering them." I almost got the feeling that behind that helmet, they were grinning. The stranger raised a hand, palm open in the direction of Les. A line of green hieroglyphics scrolled across their palm. My eyes widened. I looked to Les just in time to see him collapse to the floor, the visual link dead. "I prefer to talk in private." Thank you for listening to Cyphers Edge. Subscribe so as not to miss future episodes. Script and narration by J.J. Brandis. Music was provided by Kayor McLeish. Copyright J.J. Brandis 2024.